All right, hey everyone. We are back with Module 2.2, in which we'll be thinking specifically about the guard dog model. So, if you take a look at that Donahue et al. Reading from the 90s, you will see a description of the guard dog. And as you're reading this, I think you'll probably come to realize that there's a few sort of core pieces of this definition that are potentially confusing without backing up to think a little bit about what those concepts really mean. And so I want to begin by making a comparison between the guard dog and this watchdog or social responsibility model that we discussed in the previous module video. Of course, we know that the watchdog is essentially instructed potentially through government regulations, through journalism schools and standards for professional ethics, and through essentially the commission, the Hutchins Commission's rubric for how media should behave. All of these different things come together to influence media and make sure that they look out for the public. But the guard dog model, as you can see, if you read even just the abstract of this next piece, we know that they're looking out for someone, but that someone is a little bit difficult to understand. And so let's think about this set of assumptions. Under the guard dog model, media are not explicitly doing social responsibility behavior. They're not guided by these principles as described in that previous reading, the Peterson reading from the 60s. Also, I think it's important to note that this set of authors distinguishes the guard dog from a lapdog, which we've sort of made brief reference to as somebody or some kind of journalistic agency that is completely submissive to powerful interests. That is, they're independent of the powerful and the elites of a society. They are operating as some kind of separate, maybe private operation. Yet they are extremely terrified of ever crossing those powerful elites in society. And so therefore they always create coverage that's going to make that elite look really good, and they're going to be really, really submissive. So the lapdog, they sit on the lap of the powerful and they get their little pets for doing things that they like. We can also contrast that with the propaganda model, which might indicate that there's actually a sort of link, or there's a direct control, right? There's a merging of that fourth estate of the media with other power elites in the society to suggest that they're not all that independent at all. And so while the lapdog and the propaganda model might end up producing somewhat similar, but of course there are many different differences that we should remember. They might create some similar kinds of coverage. They are nevertheless based on some very distinct assumptions. The guard dog, however, is different from both of these models. And so the guard dog is assumed to supervise powerful groups in order to preserve not just the relative standing of an individual or a specific group, but to preserve the structure within which those groups are competing, or within which those groups have created some kind of status quo. So there's actually two kind of ways that the guard dog is going to guard this power structure or these power relationships. The first thing is that they're going to protect powerful groups that are maintaining the status quo. So anytime powerful groups are existing in the system and are perpetuating the power structure that exists, they're going to protect those groups. They're also going to be on the lookout for powerful groups that might be operating within and without those structures to try to change or break those relationships or turn those relationships on their heads. And of course, another corollary is that since they're so concerned about power structures, if there are weaker groups or groups that are not particularly integral to those power structures, they tend to just kind of ignore them. They're not going to pay them as much attention until they're knocking down the power structure itself. And that is then going to provoke a very strong reaction. So this is kind of a heuristic way of understanding when the dog will bark. The dog is not just going to bark at random. It's not going to bark entirely to alert the public to issues of social responsibility. It's not going to, protect only, the most powerful interests because they're afraid of those interests. And it's certainly not going to, bark at other groups simply because the media sort of are the members of the power elite. This sort of independent media is going to bark whenever there is some kind of threat to the status quo of power structures. I think the best way to understand this, honestly, is to look at some examples. So, institutional structures that the guard dogs might seek to protect. I think a really interesting example of this that we could, critically evaluate on the basis of this reading is the United States party system. And by that, I'm not talking about a guard dog being a proponent of Democrats or a guard dog being a proponent of Republicans. And here you can see a little bit of a difference here, right? It's not just that the guard dog has a partisan bias. It's that they're trying to preserve the system itself. And they're trying to say, look, we want to make sure that there's no threats or challenges to the prevailing party system. Similarly, we could think about prevailing economic interests or economic structures, the Federal Reserve, the New York Stock Exchange. I'm sure some of you will have lots to say in the next module or the next meeting about this ongoing sort of feud between big hedge funds and sort of the internet public on that sense. City Hall, obviously this model really has to do with local coverage most directly. And so we could think about the power structures that exist in a community where there's a political institution that culminates essentially with like a mayor's office or something. And then also we could think about what these authors call a consensus community. And the example that they use here is a homogeneous local school board. So basically a school board that is more or less a rubber stamp for the kinds of decisions that have been made since time immemorial in a specific place. And those of you who live in Montgomery County or in southern Maryland are probably well aware that this is actually something that can occasionally elicit a tremendous amount of coverage, right? As there have been several sort of big picture arguments that have been happening right now when a consensus community turns into sort of a more fractious debate about the future of schooling. So that's really the kind of thing I want to think about when we talk about these examples is when does the dog bark? If we were to look at these, so the dog barks when there are threats to the status quo of power structures. And so here are some examples, and you can see even attempts to disrupt structures from within, right? So even the people that you would expect the guard dog to be protecting, the guard dog might turn around and attack those individuals if they're trying to disrupt the system. And that is the key difference between the sort of power elite model, the lapdog model, is that this dog is no lapdog, right? It can take down sort of big players and big elite interests in a society if it feels that those elite interests are doing something that disrupts the structure. And so, like, for example, we can think about the media coverage of Donald Trump at the time that he won the 2016 Republican presidential primary. Certainly, this represented a threat to the party system because the Republican National Convention, the Republican Party itself, the elites in the Republican Party, probably didn't want Trump to win that nomination. Certainly, things look much different now in the Republican Party than they did in 2016. But if you remember, there were some more mainstream Republican candidates that were vying for the exact same position. People like Jeb Bush, right, who were probably like the legacy Republican establishment's preference for the presidential election. And of course, Trump comes in sort of, in his classic kind of bull in a china shop way and completely overturns this existing power structure within the Republican or rank and file within the Republican Party. And as you saw, media started to react. And so maybe the guard dog model can explain to some extent why the media sort of rallied around criticism of the Donald Trump presidency right at that time. Another one we could think about, for example, the Enron scandal, right? This was a company that did stuff wrong. They cooked the books, defrauded wealthy investors, and many of those Enron people, went to jail, but others, sort of escaped with golden parachutes. And so maybe this is also something where this is a company that is, overturning the economic status quo through bad behavior. Maybe the guard dog would bark then as well. Getting more local again, we could think about maybe a city council member is trying to challenge the mayor's authority. And in fact, we saw this in Baltimore City very recently, where the city council actually passed a ballot measure where actually voters got to choose whether or not the mayor was going to lose certain authority over things like the budget of the city. And actually, it turns out that those ballot measures went through, and there are several new pieces to the city's charter that actually change how powerful the mayor is. We have a very strong mayor system in Baltimore, but it's not nearly as strong as it was before these ballot measures passed. And certainly there was a tremendous amount of coverage of this story because this is potentially a threat to the institution of the mayor's office. In fact, the Baltimore Sun ran several op-eds saying that this was a bad idea. And I found that to be very interesting because it might fit with the guard dog model. And then finally, we could think about, right, this is obviously, it has nothing to do with the Montgomery County example, but we could imagine a fictional example in which a local school board makes some kind of ruling about the way they're going to do things, and appellants challenge this decision by appealing to a state court, some sort of outsiders to the existing consensus model of the school board, seeking to really change the way that the school board does things. This would be quite different than the status quo consensus of the past, and would certainly provoke local media to start barking like crazy. So the guard dog model, again, there are reasons why the guard dog might bark, but other models that are trying to explain when and where the dog barks can't always explain these particular events, whereas the guard dog model might do a better job. At least that's what the authors of this paper might argue. And so that's really where I want to leave you with this particular video, is to think about all the models that we're discussing, right? We've got the social responsibility model, we've got the libertarian model. To some extent in this paper, we've got a discussion of the lapdog model, we've got this guard dog model, we've got the Chomsky-esque propaganda model. I want you to think about the kinds of news stories that have made big headlines over the past few years, things that you remember reading about, things that you remember seeing on television. Can the guard dog model explain why the dog barked in these cases? And also, we could also, just as much think about stories where, you were maybe aware of them due to some research that you did or to do some digging, and yet you're aware also that these stories did not receive a tremendous amount of coverage. And you might also think to yourself, why did the dog not bark in that case? Can we follow the assumptions of these different models and try to arrive at a good explanation as to why media barked or didn't bark in this particular case? And, for example, if the guard dog model can explain why there was very little coverage of, the ongoing issues with water quality in Flint, Michigan, if the dog didn't really bark that loud in that case, does the guard dog model explain why that is? And if it can't explain that, if it thinks, the guard dog should have been barking, but it didn't, maybe there's an alternative explanation that could be potentially more convincing. And so that's where I leave you. That's where I want you to really chew on this reading and think about this. Remember to always keep in the back of your mind a few examples of stories that you saw in the media, or maybe stories that you thought deserved a lot more attention than what it received. And ask yourself, which of these models best explains why the dog barked or why the dog stayed silent? So that's all for this module. I hope that this made sense to you. I hope that through your reading you find this to be interesting, to be provocative, challenging. And when we come together for our class session, we're certainly going to have a lot to discuss. So I'll see you all then.